Sarah Bennett's morning started like any other busy day in downtown Chicago. The sun was barely peeking through the tall buildings as she navigated her sleek black BMW through the city streets. At 42 years old, Sarah had spent the last 15 years building her reputation at Morrison and Williams law firm, becoming one of the youngest senior partners in the firm's history. This particular Tuesday morning was especially important. She had a meeting with a major client who was facing a discrimination lawsuit, and her presence was crucial. As she approached her usual parking spot near the courthouse, Sarah's heart sank. The entire street was blocked off due to unexpected construction work. Orange cones and large machinery filled the area where she normally parked. Sarah checked her watch. 8:45 a.m. The meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock a.m., and she still needed to review some documents before it began. After circling the block twice, she spotted an empty space in a loading zone. She knew it wasn't ideal, but given the circumstances, she felt she had no choice. She carefully parked her car, grabbed her leather briefcase from the passenger seat, and hurried toward the building. The meeting went longer than expected, stretching well into the afternoon. Sarah masterfully handled the client's concerns, drawing from her years of experience in corporate law. Her colleague, James, couldn't help but admire how she broke down complex legal matters into simple terms that everyone could understand. This was why she was one of the most respected lawyers in Chicago. However, when Sarah finally left the building at 2:30 p.m., her satisfaction with the successful meeting quickly vanished. There, tucked under her windshield wiper, was a bright yellow parking ticket. She pulled it out and read the violation. Unauthorized parking in loading zone. $500 fine. The amount was unusually high for a parking violation, and something about it didn't sit right with her. As she stood there studying the ticket, Mrs. Rodriguez, who owned the small coffee shop next door, came outside to empty her trash. She had seen everything that morning and approached Sarah with concern in her eyes. "I saw when they gave you that ticket," Mrs. Rodriguez said, shaking her head. The officer barely looked at the construction signs. "He's been targeting this area all week, especially since they started the road work." Sarah listened carefully as Mrs. Rodriguez explained how several other business owners had complained about the aggressive ticketing. What caught her attention most was when Mrs. Rodriguez mentioned that she had seen the same officer give much smaller fines to other drivers in similar situations. Back in her office, Sarah couldn't focus on her work. The ticket wasn't just about the money. She could easily afford the $500 fine. It was about principle. She pulled up the city's traffic regulations on her computer and began researching. According to the rules, there were provisions for emergency parking during construction work, especially when regular parking spots were blocked. After an hour of research, Sarah made her decision. She would contest the ticket, not just for herself, but because something bigger seemed to be at play. She had heard stories from other black professionals about similar experiences with law enforcement and the justice system, but this time she had the means and position to challenge it. Sarah called her assistant, Michael, and asked him to clear her schedule for next Tuesday morning, the date set for her traffic court appearance. She could have easily sent a junior associate to handle such a minor matter, but something told her she needed to appear in person. As she prepared to head home that evening, Sarah carefully placed the ticket in her briefcase. Looking out her office window at the Chicago skyline, she thought about all the people who faced similar situations but didn't have the legal knowledge or resources to fight back. Little did she know that this simple parking ticket was about to spark a chain of events that would shake the city's judicial system to its core. The following Tuesday morning was unusually warm for Chicago. Sarah Bennett decided to dress differently than her usual court attire. Instead of her formal designer suits, she chose a simple navy blue blouse and black slacks. Her natural hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore minimal jewelry. After years of experience in courtrooms, she knew appearances could influence perceptions, and today she wanted to observe how differently she might be treated. Traffic court was held in a smaller courthouse building on the city's west side. Sarah arrived 30 minutes early and sat quietly in the back row, watching the proceedings before her case. Judge Richard Hamilton, a man in his early 60s with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, sat high on his bench looking down at each person who approached. Sarah noticed something interesting as she watched. When well-dressed white professionals approached to contest their tickets, Judge Hamilton listened patiently, often reducing their fines or dismissing them completely. However, his tone changed noticeably when dealing with minorities or people who appeared to be from lower income backgrounds. He frequently interrupted them and seemed less interested in their explanations. At 10:45 a.m., the clerk called out, "Case number 247, Sarah Bennett." Sarah walked confidently to the podium, her leather shoes making soft sounds on the worn courthouse floor. Judge Hamilton barely looked up from his papers as she approached. He was writing something, his reading glasses perched on the edge of his nose. "Another parking violation," he muttered, still not making eye contact. "How you played?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Sarah replied clearly, her voice carrying through the courtroom. Several heads turned. Her voice had the kind of authority that came from years of courtroom experience. Judge Hamilton finally looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly as he saw her. "Miss Bennett, the officer's report clearly states you were parked in a loading zone for over 5 hours. These zones are essential for local businesses." Sarah began to explain about the construction blocking regular parking spots, but the judge cut her off mid-sentence. This was something he hadn't done with previous cases she'd observed that morning. "Miss Bennett," he said, his voice carrying a tone of condescension, "perhaps you're not aware, but these rules exist for a reason. We can't have people making excuses every time they find parking inconvenient." The courtroom was quiet now. Everyone could feel the tension in the air. A young law student sitting in the back row had even started taking notes, sensing something significant was unfolding. Sarah tried again. "Your Honor, if you'll allow me to present the city ordinance regarding emergency parking during construction." "I'm quite familiar with city ordinances, Miss Bennett." Judge Hamilton interrupted again, his voice growing sharper. "What I'm not familiar with is why you think you're above these laws." A slight murmur went through the courtroom. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had come to support Sarah, shook her head in disbelief from her seat in the third row. Sarah remained calm, though she could feel her heart beating faster. She had expected some bias, but the judge's behavior was more blatant than she had anticipated. She noticed the court reporter's fingers had stopped moving across her keyboard, and the bailiff was shifting uncomfortably. "Your Honor," Sarah began again, her voice steady, "I understand the importance of traffic laws. However, according to Section 7.3 of the Municipal Code." "That will be enough," Judge Hamilton declared, tapping his gavel. "The fine stands at $500, and I'm adding a $50 court fee for wasting the court's time with these arguments." Just then, Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket. She had set it to vibrate for emergencies only. As she reached to silence it, the screen lit up with her paralegal's name and the words "Urgent, Stevens Discrimination Case Settlement." The next few moments would change everything in that courtroom, though no one knew it yet. Sarah had a decision to make: accept the unfair treatment she had just witnessed and experienced, or stand her ground and reveal who she really was. The phone kept buzzing, and Judge Hamilton's face grew increasingly annoyed at what he perceived as disrespect for his courtroom. Sarah's phone continued to buzz as Judge Hamilton glared down at her from his bench. The tension in the courtroom grew thicker with each passing second. Several people in the audience leaned forward in their seats, sensing the building confrontation. "Miss Bennett," Judge Hamilton said sharply, "either silence that phone immediately, or I'll hold you in contempt of court." Sarah took a deep breath and made her decision. She reached for her phone and answered it, looking directly at the judge. The gasps from the audience were audible. Even the bailiff's mouth fell slightly open. "This is Sarah Bennett," she said clearly, her voice echoing in the now silent courtroom. She listened for a moment, then said, "Yes, tell Mr. Stevens that as lead counsel on his discrimination case, I'll be there shortly. The settlement papers need my signature as senior partner." Judge Hamilton's face went through a series of rapid changes, from anger to confusion to sudden recognition. His hands, which had been reaching for his gavel, froze in midair. "Also," Sarah continued into the phone, still maintaining eye contact with the judge, "please have Jerry from the Civil Rights Division meet me there. We need to discuss some interesting observations from today's traffic court session." She ended the call and placed her phone back in her pocket. The courtroom remained so quiet that you could hear the old ceiling fan creaking above. "Now, Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice taking on the confident tone she used in major corporate cases, "shall we discuss why the 5 white defendants before me received warnings or reduced fines for similar parking violations, while my fine was doubled. Judge Hamilton's face had turned a shade paler. Miss Bennet, I had no idea you were a senior partner at Morrison and Williams. Sarah finished for him. Or did you mean you had no idea I was a lawyer at all? What exactly about my appearance led you to treat me differently than the other professionals who stood here today? Mrs. Rodriguez, still sitting in the third row, nodded vigorously. The law student in the back was now frantically typing on his laptop, probably realizing he was witnessing something that would be discussed in future law classes. I assure you, Judge Hamilton attempted to regain control. Your profession has nothing to do with. Let me share some numbers with you, Your Honor. Sarah interrupted, pulling a small notebook from her bag. In the hour I sat here this morning, you dismissed 4 tickets and reduced 3 fines. All 7 of those defendants were white. The 3 defendants of color who appeared, including myself, received maximum fines with additional penalties. The court reporter's fingers flew across her keyboard, recording every word. Judge Hamilton's face had now turned from pale to slightly red. Furthermore, Sarah continued, I took the liberty of requesting public records for the past 6 months of your traffic court sessions. The pattern is quite interesting. Would you like to hear the statistics? Judge Hamilton cleared his throat. Miss Bennet, perhaps we should discuss this in my chambers. With all due respect, Your Honor, Sarah replied firmly. I believe this discussion needs to happen right here, in open court on the record. She turned slightly to ensure the court reporter was still documenting everything. As an officer of the court and a senior partner specializing in discrimination law, I believe we have an opportunity here. We can either address these biases openly and work toward change, or we can take this conversation to the Judicial Review Board. Which would you prefer? The mood in the courtroom had shifted completely. The same judge who had been dismissive and condescending minutes ago now looked uncomfortable in his high seat. Several people in the audience had pulled out their phones, though they weren't taking pictures. They were looking up Sarah Bennet's impressive legal career. Judge Hamilton adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat again. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all its previous authority. Miss Bennet, would you be willing to share your analysis of our court's patterns with me? Sarah nodded, maintaining her professional demeanor. Of course, Your Honor. But first, shall we discuss the appropriate resolution for my parking ticket, considering the construction circumstances I wasn't allowed to explain earlier? The next hour in the courtroom unfolded like a carefully planned legal drama. Judge Hamilton had no choice but to dismiss Sarah's ticket, but that was just the beginning. As she opened her briefcase to put away her notes, a newspaper clipping fell out. The Chicago Law Journal's headline was clearly visible. Sarah Bennett makes history. Youngest black woman named senior partner at Morrison and Williams. A young clerk rushed to pick up the clipping, his eyes widening as he read the headline. He handed it back to Sarah with shaking hands. Miss Bennett, I've read about your work on the Thompson discrimination case. It's now taught in law schools. Judge Hamilton's face showed recognition at the mention of the Thompson case. It had been a landmark decision that changed hiring practices across 3 states. He realized he hadn't just shown bias to any lawyer, he had done so to one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in Chicago. Your Honor, Sarah said, gathering her things, I believe we should schedule a proper meeting to discuss the court's practices. My office will be in touch. Her voice was professional but carried an unmistakable weight of authority. As she turned to leave, the door of the courtroom burst open. Jerry Martinez, her colleague from the Civil Rights Division, walked in with a tablet in his hand. Sarah, I got your message and pulled up the court records you requested. The numbers are even worse than we thought. The courtroom, which had started to empty, suddenly became still again. Jerry, realizing he had walked into a tense situation, looked around awkwardly. Should I come back later? No, Sarah replied calmly. Please share what you found. The court should hear this. Jerry cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. Well, according to public records, in the past 6 months, white defendants in this court received fine reductions 73% of the time. For people of color, that number is only 12%. The average fine for white defendants is $120, while for minorities it's $475. Mrs. Rodriguez stood up from her seat. That's exactly what we've been saying in the neighborhood. Nobody would listen to us. More people started speaking up. A black business owner mentioned his 3 tickets from the same officer who had cited Sarah. An Asian student talked about her excessive fine for a minor violation. The courtroom was becoming a spontaneous forum for years of pent-up frustration. Judge Hamilton banged his gavel. Order. This is still a court of law. Yes, it is, Sarah replied firmly. And laws should be applied equally to everyone. She turned to address the people in the courtroom. If anyone has experienced similar treatment in this court, please leave your contact information with my colleague Jerry. Morrison and Williams might be interested in reviewing these cases. The judge's face turned a deep shade of red. Miss Bennett, are you threatening legal action against this court? Sarah smiled professionally. Not at all, Your Honor. I'm simply offering legal assistance to members of our community. As you know, it's our duty as officers of the court to ensure equal justice under law. She pointed to these very words carved above his bench. Just then, Sarah's phone buzzed again. It was a message from her firm's managing partner. Saw your name come up in the court database for a traffic ticket. Everything okay? As she typed a reply, she could hear people lining up to speak with Jerry. The law student from the back row was now interviewing Mrs. Rodriguez. Someone mentioned calling the local news. Judge Hamilton watched helplessly as his courtroom transformed into what looked like a civil rights movement headquarters. His years of unchecked biases had finally caught up with him, triggered by his mistake of underestimating one woman who had the power and position to challenge him. Sarah finished her message to the managing partner. Everything's fine. But we might need to open a new division for traffic court reform. I'll explain in today's partners meeting. As she walked out of the courtroom, Sarah heard Judge Hamilton already on the phone with court administration, his voice tense and defensive. She knew this was just the beginning of a much bigger change about to sweep through Chicago's judicial system. By late afternoon, Sarah's simple traffic court appearance had turned into something much bigger. The partners' meeting room at Morrison and Williams was packed. All 12 senior partners sat around the large oak table, with Sarah at the center, explaining the morning's events. So, not only did Judge Hamilton show clear bias, Sarah explained, showing slides of the court statistics on the large screen, but we've already received 43 calls from other people who faced similar treatment in his courtroom. James Chen, the managing partner, leaned forward in his leather chair. Sarah, you've stumbled onto something significant here. This could be bigger than the Thompson case. The Thompson case had made Sarah's career 3 years ago when she proved systematic discrimination at one of Chicago's largest companies. Now she might have found an even bigger issue, bias in the justice system itself. Just then, Sarah's assistant Michael rushed into the room. Sorry to interrupt, but you all need to see this. He turned on the wall-mounted TV, switching to the local news. The screen showed Mrs. Rodriguez standing outside the courthouse, surrounded by reporters. If Ms. Bennett, a respected lawyer, can be treated this way, imagine how they treat regular people like us, she was saying. The caption below read, Accusations of bias in Chicago traffic court. The room fell silent as they watched. The news report included clips from other people who had been in the courtroom that morning, describing how Sarah had stood up to the judge. They had captured the moment on their phones when she revealed her true identity. This is going viral, Michael said, holding up his tablet. Social media is exploding with similar stories. People are using hashtag #JusticeForAll and hashtag #CourtBias to share their experiences. Sarah's phone hadn't stopped buzzing with messages. Civil rights organizations were calling. Other law firms were reaching out to share data from their own cases. Even the mayor's office had left a message, requesting a meeting to discuss concerns about equal justice in our city. We need to handle this carefully, said Diana Ross, another senior partner. This isn't just about traffic court anymore. We're looking at potential systemic discrimination across the entire local justice system. Sarah nodded, thinking about all the people who had approached Jerry after court. Each story was different, but they all shared the same theme, different treatment based on race or appearance. I propose we set up a special task force, Sarah suggested. We can review cases from the past year, gather statistics, and build a comprehensive report. But more importantly, we need to propose solutions. The partners murmured in agreement. This was exactly why Sarah had become the youngest senior partner in the firm's history. She saw beyond individual cases to the bigger picture. Just then, her phone buzzed again. This time it was from Judge Hamilton's office. The message read, Judge Hamilton requests a private meeting to discuss this morning's events and possible steps forward. Sarah showed the message to her colleagues. He's feeling the pressure, James observed. The question is, do we want systemic change or just an apology? Both, Sarah replied firmly. This isn't about one judge or one court. This is about changing how justice is administered in our city. As if to emphasize her point, Michael's tablet pinged with breaking news. The Chicago Bar Association had just announced an emergency meeting to discuss bias in the court system. Judge Hamilton's courtroom had become the spark that ignited a much-needed conversation. Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline. What had started as a simple parking ticket had turned into a movement for change. She thought about all the people who had faced similar bias but didn't have the power to fight back. Schedule the meeting with Judge Hamilton, she told Michael, but make it here, in our conference room. It's time for him to see my world. The partners nodded in approval. They knew that tomorrow's meeting wouldn't just be about one judge and one lawyer. It would be about reshaping the future of justice in Chicago, one courtroom at a time. The next morning, Chicago woke up to headlines they couldn't ignore. Every major newspaper in the city carried the story. The Chicago Tribune's front page read, Senior partner exposes traffic court bias. The Sun-Times went with, Parking ticket reveals pattern of judicial discrimination. Sarah's phone had been ringing since 5 a.m. Morning shows wanted interviews. Radio stations requested comments. Her email inbox was flooded with messages from people across the country sharing similar stories. Miss Bennett, her assistant Michael called from the doorway of her office. Channel 7 is in the lobby. They're requesting an interview. Also, your parking ticket story is trending nationwide on social media. Sarah took a sip of her coffee and checked her laptop. The hashtag Justice for All had over 1 million mentions. People were sharing videos from her confrontation with Judge Hamilton, captured on phones by those present in the courtroom. Mrs. Rodriguez had become an overnight sensation, giving interviews about what she witnessed. Tell Channel 7 I'll speak with them, Sarah decided. But first, show me those new emails from other traffic court defendants. Michael pulled up a spreadsheet on his tablet. In just 24 hours, they had received over 300 emails from people who had appeared in Judge Hamilton's court. The pattern was clear. Minorities consistently received harsher penalties for the same violations. As Sarah prepared for the interview, she remembered something her grandmother used to say, sometimes a small stone can start a landslide. This small parking ticket had indeed started something big. The Channel 7 reporter, Lisa Chen, sat up in Sarah's office. Behind them, the wall of law books and Sarah's framed achievements provided the perfect backdrop. Miss Bennett, Lisa began, your stand in traffic court has sparked a national conversation. Did you expect this level of response? Sarah chose her words carefully. This isn't about one ticket or one judge. This is about a system that treats people differently based on how they look. When I walked into that courtroom dressed casually, I saw firsthand what many people experience every day. The interview was being broadcast live. In courthouses across Chicago, judges and lawyers watched on their phones and office TVs. In Judge Hamilton's courtroom, the usual proceedings had been suspended as he dealt with the growing crisis. By noon, more stories had emerged. A group of law students from Northwestern University released a study they had been working on for months. It showed similar patterns of bias in traffic courts across the city. Sarah's case had given them the attention they needed. Michael, Sarah called after the interview, get me the latest social media numbers. The statistics were staggering. The video of her courtroom confrontation had been viewed 5 million times. People were organizing protests outside multiple courthouses. Civil rights organizations were calling for a complete review of the traffic court system. Judge Hamilton's office called again. His secretary sounded desperate. The judge would like to move your meeting to today if possible. The media is camped outside his house. Sarah agreed to meet him that afternoon. As she prepared her presentation, more news broke. The state's attorney's office announced they would launch an investigation into bias in the court system. The Chicago Bar Association called for mandatory bias training for all judges. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared on the afternoon news, standing outside her coffee shop. For years, we tried to tell people about the unfair treatment in these courts, she said. It took someone with power to make them listen. Thank God for Ms. Bennett. Sarah's law firm had transformed into a command center. Junior associates were analyzing court records. Paralegals were interviewing people who had come forward. The conference room walls were covered with charts showing fine amounts, racial breakdowns, and conviction rates. Just before her meeting with Judge Hamilton, Sarah received one more email. It was from a young black law student. Watching you stand up to that judge showed me why I want to be a lawyer. Thank you for being an example of what one person can do. As Sarah gathered her files for the meeting, she looked at the framed parking ticket on her wall. Sometimes justice needed a push, and sometimes that push came from the most unexpected places. 1 week after the traffic court incident, the investigation into Judge Hamilton's court was in full swing. The conference room at Morrison and Williams looked like a war room, with papers covering every surface and computers displaying data from thousands of cases. Sarah sat at the head of the table, reviewing the latest findings with her team. Jerry Martinez, who had been working around the clock, presented the numbers on the large screen. It's worse than we thought, Jerry said, pointing to a chart. Looking at the past 5 years, we found that black defendants paid an average of 340% more in fines than white defendants for the same violations. Hispanic defendants paid 280% more. The room fell silent as they absorbed these numbers. Sarah's assistant Michael raised his hand. But that's not even the worst part. Show them what you found about the payment plans, Jerry. Jerry clicked to the next slide. When white defendants asked for time to pay their fines, Judge Hamilton approved 89% of requests. For minorities, he only approved 12%. Those who couldn't pay immediately often faced additional penalties. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had become a key witness in the investigation, brought in a box of old receipts from other shop owners in her neighborhood. We've been keeping these for years, she explained. Nobody would listen before, but now they show the pattern. The investigation team had grown to include volunteers from other law firms, civil rights organizations, and even law students. They worked in shifts, entering data, interviewing defendants, and analyzing patterns. Sarah walked around the room, looking at the various teams at work. At one desk, a group was creating a map showing how fines varied by neighborhood. At another, researchers were comparing Judge Hamilton's records with other judges in the city. Ms. Bennett called out Emma, a first-year associate. We found something interesting in the court transcripts. Judge Hamilton used different language depending on the defendant's race. He used words like responsible and honest mistake for white defendants, but irresponsible and chronic offender for minorities with similar records. The evidence was becoming overwhelming. Sarah's phone rang. It was James Chen, the managing partner, calling from a meeting with the state's attorney. Sarah, they're taking this all the way to the state Supreme Court, James said excitedly. They want you to present the findings next month. This could change traffic courts across the entire state. Just then, a young intern rushed in with breaking news. Judge Hamilton had just announced he was taking a leave of absence. The pressure from the media and the mounting evidence had become too much. But Sarah knew removing one judge wouldn't solve the deeper problem. She gathered her team around the conference table. This investigation isn't just about Judge Hamilton anymore, she explained. We need to look at the whole system. How many other judges are showing these patterns? How many courts need to change? The team worked late into the night, ordering pizza and reviewing case after case. They found similar patterns in other courtrooms, though few were as extreme as Judge Hamilton's. Around midnight, Sarah received an unexpected email. It was from Judge Hamilton's daughter, a law student at the University of Chicago. Dear Ms. Bennett, the email read, I want to thank you for exposing these issues. My father's actions don't reflect the values he taught us at home. This investigation has forced him to confront his own biases. He's starting to understand the impact of his actions. Sarah shared the email with her team. It reminded them that their work wasn't about punishing one person. It was about changing a system. The next morning, the State Bar Association announced new requirements for all judges: mandatory bias training, regular review of sentencing patterns, and independent oversight of fine structures. As Sarah prepared the final investigation report, she looked at the wall of her office where she'd hung that first parking ticket. Next to it now was a photo of her team: lawyers, students, community members, all working together for change. Sometimes, she said to Michael as he brought in more files. Justice doesn't just happen in the courtroom. Sometimes it happens in rooms like this, with people who refuse to accept unfairness as normal. 6 months after the parking ticket incident, Sarah Bennett stood at the podium in the main hall of the Chicago Bar Association. The room was packed with judges, lawyers, and community members. She was about to present the final results of their investigation and the new changes coming to Chicago's court system. What started with a simple parking ticket, Sarah began, revealed a problem that affected thousands of lives. Today, we're not here to point fingers. We're here to talk about solutions. In the front row sat Mrs. Rodriguez, now the head of a community oversight committee. Next to her was Jerry Martinez, recently promoted to partner at Morrison and Williams for his work on the investigation. Judge Hamilton was there too, sitting quietly in the back, a changed man after months of reflection and training. Sarah clicked to her first slide. Thanks to our investigation, every traffic court in Chicago will now have these new rules. First, all fines must be reviewed by an independent committee. Second, judges must explain in writing any fine above the standard amount. Third, monthly audits will check for bias in sentencing. The audience listened intently as Sarah shared more changes. Courts would now offer evening sessions for working people. Payment plans would be available to everyone. Most importantly, all judges would undergo regular bias training. But the biggest change, Sarah continued, is in how we view justice itself. It's not just about laws, it's about treating everyone with equal respect and dignity. As she spoke, Michael handed out copies of the Equal Justice Initiative, a new program that Sarah's firm had created. It would provide free legal help to people who believe they face discrimination in traffic court. Already, 5 other law firms had joined the program. Judge Hamilton stood up during the question period. The room went quiet. This was his first public appearance since the investigation began. "Miss Bennett," he said, his voice humbler than before, "your parking ticket taught me something important. I never thought of myself as biased, but the numbers don't lie. Thank you for helping me see what I couldn't see before." Sarah nodded respectfully. Over the past months, she had seen real change in the judge. He had not only completed extensive bias training, but had also started mentoring young lawyers from minority backgrounds. After the presentation, Sarah walked through the courthouse where it all began. The walls now displayed signs in multiple languages explaining people's rights. A new help desk assisted those who couldn't afford lawyers. The long lines of frustrated people were gone, replaced by an efficient and fair system. Outside, she met a young woman who was contesting a parking ticket. "Are you Sarah Bennett?" the woman asked excitedly. "I read about you in law school. Because of your case, I decided to become a civil rights lawyer." Sarah smiled and reached into her briefcase. She pulled out a copy of the original parking ticket, now framed alongside the Chicago Tribune article about the investigation. "Keep this," she told the young woman. "Remember that change can start with something small." Back at her office, Sarah found a surprise waiting. The managing partners had dedicated a new conference room in her name. The Bennett Room would be used to train young lawyers in civil rights law and bias awareness. As she sat at her desk, Sarah opened her email to find messages from law firms across the country. They wanted to know how to start similar programs in their cities. Her small stand against injustice was creating waves far beyond Chicago. Michael knocked on her door with one last piece of news. "The state Supreme Court just adopted our recommendations. Every court in Illinois will now follow the Chicago model. You did it, Sarah." Sarah looked at the city skyline through her window. She thought about all the people who would now get fair treatment in court, regardless of how they looked or dressed. She thought about Judge Hamilton, who had learned to face his biases. She thought about Mrs. Rodriguez and all the community members who finally had a voice. "No, Michael," she said with a smile, "we all did it. Sometimes justice just needs someone to take the first step." The parking ticket that started it all hung on her wall, a reminder that real change doesn't always come from big plans or grand gestures. Sometimes it comes from standing up for what's right, even in the smallest moments.